Great. All right. Hello, everybody. Good day, good morning, afternoon, evening, and welcome to another episode of BlockChai and Chill. I have my drink right here, and today we have a wonderful guest, my dear friend and co-founder Chase Chapman.
I'm
Welcome,
very excited to
Chase.
be
How are
here.
you?
I am wonderful. How are you?
I'm just fine, and I'm much better now that I get to say hi to you and chat with you for the next hour. So it's awesome.
I love it. I'm excited. This will be
All right.
fun.
So today I think we are going to be talking about DAOs. So for the people in this audience who have no idea what DAOs are, this will be an interesting session. We'll go into the basics of it and then maybe go into a little deeper topics also. But why don't we start with you telling us a little bit about yourself, Chase?
Yes. So I'm Chase. I am a co-founder of Decentology, now more of an advisor, and get to help out and poke around a little bit on the DAO side of things, which has been so fun. But I got into crypto and was super interested in like all of these human and economic systems, I guess, even before I got into crypto when I was in kind of high school. So I did, Model United Nations and all the things, which is funny. I never used to mention that, but now I'm like, wow, that did kind of set the scene for me getting super into DAOs.
Yeah.
And so now, of course, I got into crypto just through being in like a marketing role and thinking a lot about data and ownership and all that stuff. Got interested in what we now call Web3, but it's funny to see what the terms evolve to. And got involved with an org called She256, which is wonderful, out of UC Berkeley. And they matched me with a wonderful mentor, Mr. Nick Kalyani. This was a while back. And so we started working on just cool stuff to make the world of crypto easier and more accessible. And Nick was working on a super interesting login component where you logged in. It was a wallet, but it was with a photo and a series of emojis. Which I believe still has some things going on there. But in any case, got super interested in this world. Nick helped me fall down the rabbit hole. We became co-founders, built what is now Decentology, and now I'm doing a bunch of different DAO stuff, which has been super fun.
Excellent. What's like the most interesting thing you've done DAO related this week?
Ooh, this week. That's a good question. Well, it's Thursday. I have to backtrack for myself. We're coming up with a new, well, I guess two things. One, I'm working on something for Decentology that I'm very excited about. And so I got to, it's going to be something that I'm sure we'll do sessions on and release soon. But the little hint of it is I got to literally just like mine my brain for every DAO tool I've ever seen, which was actually quite fun. It was cool to be like, holy crap, this ecosystem is huge. And then the other one is we're working on a new structure for Women in Index, which is a group that I help co-lead within Index Co-op, which is a DAO. And it's been interesting to sort of work through what we want that to look like and how we communicate all of that.
Wow.
That was kind of two boring answers, I guess. I don't know if those were very interesting, but
it's interesting stuff. It's all cutting edge stuff. It's all new. It combines, humanity and society and emotions and technology and decision making and everything. Put it into a big pot, stir it up, and see what pops up. So we'll experiment with different recipes, I feel, until we come up with the right one. So thanks for the intro, Chase. So I'm Nick Kalyani. I'm the other co-founder of Decentology, and I'm really excited to be talking today with you, Chase. So let's just dive right into it. I think we should start with the basics. I mean, I think everyone understands what DAO, the acronym, stands for: Decentralized Autonomous Organization. So sorry, I had to pass.
I was like, are you going to make something crazy up? There was a good chance that you were.
I've had authentication on my mind. I was about to say that. I'm like, no, that's not it. And I paused in the right time. But really, help us understand what it means in practice.
Yeah. So like you said, DAOs are decentralized autonomous organizations. I think that knowing that acronym does very little to understand what DAOs actually are in practice. So the way that I like to think about DAOs is companies just owned by the people who create value in them. When you think about it that way, everything becomes so much easier. People love to talk about stuff on Twitter and write overly complicated pieces about DAOs. But at the end of the day, they're basically co-ops, which is just like, hey, all the employees of this organization own it. That's how we govern. That's how we do sort of everything around the company. And so that's essentially what a DAO is at its basic level. There are two things that I like to point out that make DAOs a little bit different from a traditional company. The first is what I mentioned around ownership. People who create value in the DAO are owners. That could be people in the community, that could be employees, that could also be the users of your product. All of those people are encouraged and create a system in which they can own the organization. The second piece that's really important that people sometimes forget about is self-management. So like one of the important things that's happened over the past 10 years in companies is basically like organizations have realized that hierarchical structures with a CEO at the top who makes decisions on everything kind of don't work as well as if you actually empower people to make decisions. That's not to say that you can't have CEOs. It's just you're much better off when you allow people to manage themselves. And so self-management is the other really important piece that ownership sort of supports, but also that makes a lot of things possible because people aren't looking to a boss necessarily, but instead are delegated decision-making power and ability to execute on certain things when they think it's right. And so that's sort of the other cool thing about DAOs that gets me excited, that makes them a little bit different.
So let me put on my skeptical hat. I don't have too many of those. I just have one because I have many optimistic hats. But to me, it seems like that could work in a number of situations, but I can think of lots of situations where that's not going to work very well because you like a lot of people don't even have the knowledge or the information or the context to be able to make good decisions, right? So do you think like DAOs are going to be able to work in all scenarios where we have companies today, or is it just going to be certain scenarios?
I think it will work in a lot of scenarios, but what you bring up is a good point, which is that I feel like today everybody thinks that DAOs are these like organizations where everyone votes on everything. And the reality is that that just shouldn't be the case. We've seen that that doesn't work. There's a DAO and product called Sushi Swap that has very recently realized this doesn't work. It was very hard for them to get compensation for contributors through even because the community was voting on something that they are not well versed in. And so I think what we're seeing in DAOs is actually that when you think about decision making, what should really happen is you should have people who have domain expertise and essentially allow the DAO to delegate decision making power to those people. A perfect example of this is, Nick, let's say that you are a product expert. Like you are so good at like building product, shipping, getting shit done. Awesome. You, let's say, are really not good at HR. Like HR is not your thing. No. But Niharika is really good at HR, for example. Let's say that that's the case. We should make sure that you have decision-making power and ability to execute on a certain set of decisions within the realm of product. And Niharika has that for HR. And so, and I think what we'll end up seeing is like smaller teams that basically are allowed to do these things, have the autonomy to make these decisions, have a certain scope and all of that kind of stuff. It looks kind of like a company. It's just that it's essentially these smaller groups that do also own the organization. So I think that's how it's going to evolve probably. Like DAOs for the next 5 years, most of them probably won't even look very different from companies. It's just that the ownership structure is different, and that's mostly it. So yeah, that will be.
Let me continue playing skeptic and say that in a typical, say, startup or whatever, with equity ownership for all employees that they vest into and earn over time, that gives them sort of the same thing, except I understand the key difference being that the founders have a significant chunk of it. Is that different in DAOs or is that the same?
I think DAO founders tend to have a large chunk of ownership. I think it's more fairly distributed than traditionally. I think the other thing that's big in the difference between a way that a traditional startup has been operating for the last 10 years with equity and DAOs is that DAOs tend to have a very specific governance structure that allows you to exercise those ownership rights, which doesn't really happen in startups because you're given, as an employee, You know, generally like a smaller amount than you might be given in a DAO. It really depends on how early you are, of course, but you're not really encouraged to participate in the governance process usually. And so I think that that's a big difference. And the other weird thing that I would add, this is not true for all DAOs, but a lot of DAOs have these tokens that represent ownership available in public markets. And so I would say the other really weird difference that maybe in theory we forget about, but in practice is usually very true, is that anyone can buy into your ownership into your organization. It's not like you have these closed venture capital rounds. You have an open market as if you've already IPO'd. And that creates some new and interesting challenges and opportunities for people to come in. But yeah, I think that's the other big difference.
Okay. So I understand now. I can see the difference. You know, we've talked about DAOs kind of like in the abstract, like they already exist. But if someone had an idea, how would they even evaluate if it's DAO worthy? And if it was, what would some of the steps they would take in order to, you know, get it going?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the question around whether or not something is DAO worthy is around whether you're willing to be somewhat open and transparent with who you let in, which doesn't always have to be the case, but like generally is how a lot of DAOs are approaching these things. If you're doing something that's top secret, having several people who are members and owners that are permissionless is probably not ideal, though. Again, you could make it work. I think also if you're doing something that is quite like a sort of one-man show type deal with very little room for engagement from other people, it's probably not a good fit for a DAO. And then the final piece that I think is currently how we think about DAOs, but probably isn't how we're going to be thinking about them in the future. It's been really hard for some DAOs to find product market fit because you're basically trying to like create value and move really, really quickly as a decentralized organization. I think the reason that we've seen that is we tend to overemphasize decentralized and not distributed. So like decentralized, meaning anyone can do anything they want. Distributed, meaning trusted parties who have been chosen by a decentralized group can do the things that we've decided they're allowed to make decisions on. So I think like over time that will evolve, but it's certainly a little bit harder. And then I'm also seeing something in the chat around like whether or not DAOs are an interesting solution for open source. And I think DAOs are one of the best solutions for open source because you have this, well, Web3 in general is a really interesting sort of space for open source because it's all very composable. What Decentology is doing with the Hyperverse is a perfect example of this. And so being able to monetize different layers of that and have owners of it instead of having a big company like Facebook come in and basically subsidize the whole thing is incredibly important. And so I'm very excited about open source stuff with DAOs. We can talk about that in a moment. But if you're going to start a DAO, the basic playbook is this. Every DAO has a couple of key things. They have an aim and a purpose. That's really, really important. They have a group of people who are starting out as contributors who've made commitments to the DAO to make sure that they're consistently going to do that. It's important for early members. And they have a treasury. Now, you don't have to have all of those things in like perfect condition, but that tends to be sort of the basic anatomy of an early DAO. You also need to have a meeting place, which is often Discord, which is very flawed, but that's where DAOs are at today. And so from there, you start choosing the people who you think are really great, sort of like early contributors to your aim and your purpose. You choose that smaller group and get them on board. And then from there, you start sort of building like you would in a startup, basically, where you have these very simple like practices. The one thing that I think is really important there is choosing how you want to go about a lot of these conversations and how you want power to be distributed. I feel like people start off by designing all of these crazy complex governance systems. Something that we've learned a lot from self-managing organizations is like start with the MVG, like the minimum viable governance, and then build on top of it as you need it. And instead of laying out every process you could ever imagine, see what people do and then codify it. So like Wikipedia is a good example of this. I'm going to go on a little tangent. It will be not too long. But so Wikipedia, before Wikipedia started, there was another, one of the same co-founders tried something called Newpedia, which completely failed. And it was very similar to Wikipedia. The reason that it failed was it had all of these processes and requirements for people who wanted to contribute to any page. And that made it incredibly like hard for new people to come in. There wasn't really community around it. And so it failed. Wikipedia completely took away all of that and basically just created a container for anyone to contribute. They famously had someone have a very profane image that they put on the front page of Wikipedia because they made it so open. And, you know, of course, when that happens, you're like, oh, perhaps we should make it so that people, you know, have certain edit access. But you do it as these things emerge instead of making all of these rules early on. And so that's one of the big philosophies I think that's most important is like, it doesn't matter if you get anything, if you get everything wrong, basically. What matters is that you slowly document what's working and what isn't working and you experiment. And then from there, you have a much more effective system, which I feel like is counterintuitive because a lot of people want to like make all these game mechanics and do it all, which is fair and fun, but also it's much more effective to see how some of these things emerge first.
Yeah, I think simplicity is always good. So, you know, what you described, they had a lot of moving parts, etc. So I want to kind of break it down. And I really like that Vishen's there asked about open source. By the way, he's a good buddy of mine from the DNN days. And so people who have been in open source communities, large scale, they can completely relate to DAOs, etc., because the models are very similar. It is more about what you contribute, you know, and it is also sort of transient, where in open source communities, you don't assume that someone's going to be there all the time. Life happens and they go away for a few months or whatever, and you don't look at that negatively or like, oh, you got to be fired or whatever. It's like, yeah, life happened and you went away. And then there's recognition, etc., for what you've done. So there's a lot of parallels. And I can see how also as open source projects, they mature, the burden of not the burden, rather, the friction for onboarding new users becomes more intense, because before, if someone found a bug, they would just submit an issue, boom, they would just write it out. Then it evolves, and now you've got these like 2-page form you got to fill out for an issue, like, did you do this? Did you do this? What time of the day was it? How did you test it, etc. And the friction becomes so people go like, yeah, I'm not going to contribute. And what happens then is that the people who are there, they continue to do it until they get burned out, you know? And then everything implodes. And I can see tweets and all that about DAO burnout and etc., all of that happening. So let's back up a little bit and talk a little bit about sort of the formation of the DAO. Just because you have an idea, you know, forming a DAO and inviting people to join, etc., to me, that doesn't seem like the right way to go about it. It would be better if there were a core team of people who started building together and then sort of branched out and expanded. Like, what do you think about, like, what are some models you're seeing, and what are the successful DAOs? How are they getting started?
Yeah, you're bringing up a really good point, which is like, I think I would go back and change my answer to that when I'm thinking about it in this context. I think the type of DAO that you're building matters. So like what you're actually doing changes what is important when you're starting. If you're building a product, you probably do just want to start a group chat with some people who you know, trust, want to collaborate with, and start building stuff and like see how it goes. And then if it seems to be working and you want to bring more people in and all of that, and you have a community that starts to form, cool, like those people can start to join, and then you can more organically sort of move towards a DAO. If you're creating a DAO for example, buying something, like Constitution DAO got a lot of press and there were a lot of challenges with the way that they did things. But basically, for anyone who isn't familiar with it, the Constitution, a copy of the Constitution was up for sale at Sotheby's, I believe. And a group of internet strangers got together and basically crowdfunded $40 million, which was over the estimated amount that the Constitution was going to go for. They funded this all together using the Treasury, like I was talking about, and then they tried to buy the Constitution. It failed, but the point is they didn't need to get together. Originally, of course, it was people in a group chat who were helping organize this and create the multi-sig, which is this sort of shared treasury or wallet that is at the heart of a lot of DAOs. But that was actually, it was like the group chat and the treasury that was probably the most important to start with, because that was the function of what they were doing. And then they slowly built a community around it versus a product where you're starting to actually build stuff and then invite people in and then do the financial part. So I think it definitely depends. And I would also say that whatever is like intuitive and the way that you would probably do a startup is often the correct way for DAOs. And when it's to start, and then when it's ready to move into the, onto the Web3 rails, then you can cross that bridge when you get there. But I think trying to like understand what the perfect thing to do for starting a DAO is an easy way to never get anywhere. And yeah, I think it does really depend on the project.
Yeah, I like that. So key takeaway is when you're starting a DAO, go with the least friction, the most organic way possible, and don't try and fit a certain mold or whatever that you've seen other DAOs do. Just get going and figure out what is going to be the most natural way to go about it. I like that.
Yeah. And if you ever get stuck, what I always do when I'm like, why doesn't this work? Am I doing this right? The thing that I always look at is self-managing organizations or teal organizations or flat organizations. I'm not kidding you. The number of times I Google problem flat organizations is like crazy, because there are startups that have successfully started and scaled as self-managing organizations that are just traditional companies. And so if that's what you're getting caught in like the loop of, there is so much literature on just the human side of how to do this stuff. It often, I think, is about just like knowing what to do, but I think it is the most organic and natural thing that's probably going to be the best.
Okay, so now you've got past that initial hump, you've figured out, you've got some people together. Now let's talk about the second part that you addressed, which is the governance aspect of it. And earlier in the conversation, you used the term collective, right? So I'm familiar with collectives from my local farmers market. They take over a street on a Saturday or a Sunday, and all these small vendors, sell their vegetables and wares and crafts and all that. But they've all formed a collective because they negotiate with the city to have that street closed. They negotiate, the price that everyone has to pay, the parking, all of that kind of stuff, and it kind of works. So in that, the governance is basically just delegated to whoever's organizing this thing, right? I mean, there's not a whole lot there. Everyone says, yep, I'm in it or I'm not in it. But DAO governance can become more complicated. Let's dive into a little more detail about the types of governance models that you think are workable. So we talked about the product one, and we talked about the group buying activity or community activity of some kind. What are the governance models you would implement there?
Yeah, so when I think about governance, I feel like the biggest, most important thing is distinguishing between like governance of like a system of nodes that are differentiated versus not differentiated. So the genesis of like blockchain technology was Bitcoin. And the interesting thing about Bitcoin and the way that it essentially does governance is it comes to consensus using cryptographic proofs. So it's like math. And because it's math and because it's all like nodes in this network that are very, very similar, like maybe they're using different software or they are different hardware, but at the end of the day, they're quite similar. The single value add of one node theoretically is not different from another one. And so what has emerged out of that is consensus-based governance, because if every node is in agreement, that it means that the math is correct. No single node is like better at math and understands the proof more than others. And so there's not a need for different types of governance because you can really easily do that. TCP/IP is similar in the sense that like nodes within a network can only do a certain amount of things. Now, I'm not technical enough to be talking about TCP/IP, but I was reading about this. And so nodes within the system can only do like a certain number of things. And so there's really not like a differentiation, which means that there's a lot of efficiency in moving information because, again, no single node is better than another. Cool. That means consensus-based governance works. Everyone comes to a conclusion. But when you get into weirder things, like how much should people get paid, it becomes much more complicated because everyone has different opinions. And in other situations, like let's say, what product should we build? Some people actually might have a better understanding of a market than others. And so you have these like different, not only opinions, but also different amounts of value that a given person is adding to a network. And it's really hard to assess how much value a given person is adding also. And so you start, as you add like human layers, to get a lot more complexity in governance. What's interesting is that today in DAOs, we've really inherited like a lot of the consensus-based governance of fully decentralized networks like Bitcoin and Ethereum. And the problem with doing that is that humans are not like that. So I think one of the interesting things that's starting to emerge is, for a while we had these systems where we're like, okay, cool. We're buying the Constitution, for example. This is all people who put in their money, who have probably tokens in return in proportion to the amount of money that they contributed. Fine. In that type of system, you can probably do a majority wins vote, which is kind of like its own version of consensus. Sort of. And so it's like, okay, cool. We'll buy the Constitution. Yes, no, this is this. But as you have something that looks a lot more like a company, and you have the need to say, okay, cool, Nick is much better at product, Niharika is much better at HR, and Chase is much better at marketing, let's say, that's when you want to start to take those distributed systems and allocate power to those people who actually are domain experts. And so that's when at a DAO level, we start to define, okay, what does product mean? And what are the decisions that are being made within product? Among those decisions, what do we want to delegate to who? And what is the scope of that delegation? And so I think that's at like the basic sort of level, how I'm starting to think about governance. Now, of course, you can get funky with it because each individual unit can have their own version of governance depending on what it looks like for them. But I think like essentially what that all boils down to is, what mechanism do you use to make decisions? Is it consensus? Is it consent, which is a governance system that I'm really excited about? Is it just quorum? What is it? And who is making those decisions? And when you boil it down to those two things, it just becomes so much less complicated, because you can break down the DAO into different focus areas and whatever, but you still only have to think about those two things. And then everything else just, sort of falls into place.
One thing I've learned over time, working on startups and software, is that you can engineer and dream of software perfectly, but then you throw humans into the mix and it all just falls apart. And one particular thing that I'm thinking of here is around compensation. There's like, you talked about domain experts, etc. And we live in a world right now which is very largely driven by your experience, and your longevity at a certain job drives how much you make. And then you step into this DAO and it's like, no, we are going to ignore all of that. It's all going to be equal, whatever. And it's going to cause, like, first of all, you may not get the best talent. And if you do get the best talent, they may not be happy, or if they do get paid more, everyone else will be unhappy, because one of the things is everything is transparent, right? Everyone knows how much everyone's being paid. So how is that going to work?
I think right now in DAOs, people love to make things permissionless. They're like, anyone can pick up work. But someone that I had on my podcast that actually came out today was saying that, like, just because someone raises their hand doesn't mean that they're the right person for the job. Yeah. And I feel like that's the problem that you're getting at. I think that one of the biggest things that we're going to see that people should not shy away from, but are sort of shying away from right now, is DAOs saying, okay, there's like concentric circles of contributors. You have the outside of people who are like in the community, attend events, don't really actually do a lot. And then you have people who are more committed community members who are like, hey, I want to answer questions and I want to help do this and help do that. And that's really cool. And some people will want to stay in that circle. That's totally fine. Those are the types of people you probably want to pay per like task that they're doing, you know, based on that. And then as you get closer into the circle, people take on more responsibilities. And I think what that really like comes down to is a commitment that they're making to the DAO, but also that the DAO should be making to them on a compensation level. And if the DAO is making any sort of commitment, and if there's any commitment made on either side, there should be more filters to make sure that the fit is right. And so I think as you get closer and closer in the circle, it should be more and more permissioned, not based on what a single individual thinks, but a lot of self-managing orgs will basically have like a smaller hiring circle that is chosen by the entire org to make hiring decisions. And I think that that type of thing is important. I know it sounds exactly like a normal company because that's what all of DAOs is just figuring out. Like, do companies do this because it's stupid and it evolves somehow, or is this actually the way that we should do things? And so like, that is one where it actually makes sense. And so I think that, that a lot of like the whole challenge that you're talking about is really going to be choosing more and more people. That could look like an anonymous hiring system. It could look a million different ways, but I think that's ultimately what's going to end up happening, because it doesn't make sense for anyone to be able to contribute and get a full-time job in an organization they've never been hired at.
Yeah, yeah. That does raise the question about, okay, so you've got people that made it through this process, etc. And what happens if they're a bad actor? They're just completely incompetent, or they just blow things off, etc. How do you do the reverse of onboarding? I forget what the word is. Unonboarding? No, there's probably a
Hiring.
hiring. Yeah, how do you do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is something that I've struggled with, that I think a lot of people in the DAO ecosystem have struggled with, because it's an uncomfortable conversation. One of the things that I've learned also from the world of self-management, and I don't know, I'm sure that open source, we could also learn a lot from open source ecosystems. So I'm curious how that works, but
we just deny them access to the repo and and then they're done.
That's it.
It doesn't really matter. or block them from the forum and then they're done, you know.
That's fair. Then they come back as another anonymous platypus, and they're like, hey. Yeah, I want to hear about those processes, but I will say from the self-managing world, what I've learned so far, which I'm by no means an expert in, is they basically have a process that anyone can trigger. And so if I think that, Nick, you're doing a shitty job, I can trigger this process, and it essentially goes through like a series of procedures. And I can't remember exactly what they are, but at the end, one of the big ones is whoever is deciding on hiring or whoever's working with them, you know, you can choose what the group is, but you have some group that you ask, if you knew what you knew now, would you hire this person again? And if the answer is no, like to a reasonable degree, which by the way, different decisions definitely need different governance mechanisms, and this is one of them. If the answer is no from like a reasonable amount of people, that's when you sort of decide to part ways. You can always have a process to like almost repeal, if I think that's the right word, but like ask again, like, can you please, can I go through this process again? But yeah, that's the system that I've seen in self-managing orgs that I think DAOs could learn a lot from. But what is it like in open source ecosystems?
I think there's conversations that happen. There's teams, right? So there's a core team, and then there's specific teams, etc. And if someone's generally, you try and be very gentle about it, because it's all volunteers. And when it's volunteers, you have to take a very different stance than if they are paid. If they're paid, then you can take a harsher stance around performance. But even when you're volunteers, you still expect a certain level of quality and commitment, etc. And if you don't meet that threshold, then you have to leave. I mean, that's just how the world works. But yeah, it's a much gentler because of volunteerism, you know. So
yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So now is I want to get into a little bit of the mechanics of things, and then I want to leave some time for people to ask questions. By the way, if you have any questions, start please putting them in the chat, and we'll start tackling them in about 5 to 7 minutes. But I want to get into mechanics of like actual running a DAO. Now, you and I and most of the world both know, all know that the autonomous part of it is really not autonomous right now. There is zero smart contract stuff really happening beyond the tokens, etc., all the voting, etc., is really off chain. So how is that happening? What is the predominant tool people are using, and walk us through, how a governance action occurs.
Yeah, so some of the most popular tools today are Snapshot. A few DAOs have their own voting tools, like MakerDAO, which is one of the oldest DAOs, has built their own voting tool. It really depends. So Snapshot has officially announced that they're working with Starkware, which is a layer 2 blockchain, and they're going to be offering on-chain voting through something called Snapshot X, which is pretty cool. But it's like much cheaper or free because it's using a layer 2, which is great. So there are definitely, we're definitely moving towards taking voting and putting it on chain, but generally the way that voting works in DAOs is, and I like to start from the beginning because some people want to like know right away because they want to join a DAO and then do it. Usually if you're like proposing something, you probably want to have been in the community for a while, which I'm sure open source is the same way. You don't want to just, like a pull request is one thing, but being like, I'd like to change our entire system, is like definitely not a day one feat.
No one's going to take you seriously. So
yeah, exactly. That's exactly how it is in DAOs. People are really the same, and open source is such a good example of that. But so the way that it tends to work is a member of the DAO or someone who is in the community sees some tension that exists and has some proposal. That tension could be like not something that's actually a tension, but something that exists that creates way for a proposal. Oftentimes they're writing up that proposal, sharing it with like members of the community who are like influential and have a lot of context on that specific thing, which is really important. I think people kind of tend to forget about that, but that's a big part. Now, like the other interesting thing when you think about, when I think about voting, is this is how it works. I'll give like I don't want to go crazy long on this. I'll give a short thing of how it works today and then how I think it should work. So people write things up. You often do a temperature check in the DAO, not always, but that's common. You share it with the community, see what they think, get that feedback, make changes, and then do an official vote on it. If the vote passes, that often means that it goes into effect. Boom, you're done. Oftentimes, a lot of these things get stuck in this like in-between phase where you're kind of doing a lot of like, okay, we're going to, take all this feedback and Sally thinks this is great, but this other person thinks it's terrible, yada, yada, yada. And so that's one of the problems, which is why what I want to move towards, which also comes from self-managing ecosystems, this is my current obsession, is consent-based voting. So when you do this kind of voting I'm describing in the beginning, you usually need to reach a quorum. So you need to have at least 30% of outstanding tokens, let's say, as an example, participate in the vote. If whichever side is the majority, that's what passes and it's done. In another system, which is consent-based voting, what actually happens is you have someone who sees attention, creates a proposal. They get anyone who is in the scope of that proposal together and gets like judgment-free feedback, like no judgment of it, just saying this is how I feel when I see this. And then feedback saying like, this is what would make it interesting to me. And the core question that you're asking is not, should we do this thing? It's actually, does this feel safe to try? And by asking if it feels safe to try, you move away from this like tendency for democratic systems to get nothing done and change nothing that we've seen at a very like large scale and small scale. You move away from that and instead you move towards experimentation and iteration, which is much more interesting. So you're asking people, does this feel safe to try? They give their thoughts. You take all of that feedback, you process it as the creator of the proposal, and then you say, okay, cool, I've created this, let's take it to vote. Does this feel safe to try? And anyone who meets a certain threshold of ownership is allowed to say no. And if they say no, the proposal cannot continue. But whoever says no, it's their responsibility to come up with something and propose something that makes it safe to try. So you can't just be like, haha, no, I don't want to do that. If Sally doesn't like it, she has to say, this is the part that makes it feel less safe to me. It would feel safe to try if we did this instead. And so then they work with the proposer to come to a conclusion, and you put it up for vote again. And then if it feels safe to try for everyone, then you pass it. And I'm much more interested in that because that's like way better than trying to get everybody on board with,
Yeah, but in that scenario, if the person who objects does nothing, does that mean that they get ignored then?
Yeah.
Okay. So it
Because
is,
like if you're not going to take on the responsibility to fix it, then like you don't have the right to say no.
all right.
If
So
the changes they're saying are like so crazy, or if a lot of people say no, then it's probably a reflection of the proposal itself. But yeah.
yeah, what's the quote for democracy to fail? All good men have to do is nothing or something. It's more eloquent than that. But yeah, so essentially, a bad actor could get something done in the DAO if people just sit back and do nothing about it.
Yeah, that's why I think having these smaller groups that are very like, because if you as an individual have to look at every single proposal in every single domain, this is never going to work. I think it works much better in smaller groups, like, ideally less than 10 or 20 people, bigger if you need to for some votes, but definitely ideally not many of them. Yeah, it works much better in a system where people are trusted. Like the only people who can come up with a proposal are in that system, and the only people who can deny that proposal are in the system.
Yeah, I can see how time plays a significant factor in this, because if everything has to be subject, not everything, assuming that at the smaller group level, etc., not, there are people who are empowered to make decisions, etc. But in general, we know, like, for example, how Congress works, right? It takes forever to get a bill passed or whatever.
Mhm.
So is that kind of the same thing? Is like you have uh, uh, there's not as much rapid activity because everything has to go through governance. Like, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, the goal of that consent-based system is really that you can have a lot more happening, because ultimately it's interesting. I think when you have a hierarchy, you have a similar problem, which is that if you ask an individual to like make all of these decisions, they could make decisions really quickly, but they also might not be the right decisions, and people still have to propose stuff. It's just that you're asking one person to approve it instead of a bunch of people. So I think it puts the decisions closer to the people with context, which if you have small enough groups, they shouldn't be making like a million decisions. And also the other thing that's interesting is defining the roles of people within those small groups is really important. Like if you're in the product circle, there should be specific roles or responsibilities that don't go through governance, because everyone has like consented to you making those decisions on your own. And I think that's important too. It's like, so Emerald City, which Decentology just announced a grant for, had a town hall, and people were talking about what they should name a product. That's a perfect example of a decision that probably doesn't need to go through governance, but it's sort of like on the fence. And you could see how these things get a little fuzzy, but defining those responsibilities and scope of decisions that people can have, I think is probably an important way to mitigate the like tyranny of decision, just a high number of decision making.
Yeah. So I don't see any questions in the chat, so I'm going to continue asking you some more questions. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about what's actually happening on the ground here. So in your experience working with different DAOs right now, and even like learning about them, which DAO is the most effective and efficient, not the largest, but most effective and efficient at furthering a model that could, is sustainable and could be very successful?
I know that I keep talking about self-managing orgs, but the Ready, which is not actually a DAO, but they're a consulting company that helps organizations become more self-managing, which is like a service. There are lots of service DAOs, which is basically a consulting company. So in some ways, they're kind of like that. I think that they have a really good model internally for the way that they do governance. I think they're about 150 people, and it's really impressive. So like from a just organizational design perspective, they've existed for many years. They've done a great job organizing their governance. I'm very impressed by them. On the ground, DAO wise, I think Index Co-op is doing some really interesting stuff when it comes to breaking up some of these groups. They're experimenting with a couple things that I think I'm excited to see what ends up happening. So For example, they have something called the Index Council, which is a group of people who are elected by the DAO to make a lot of these like higher level decisions that it's hard for different groups themselves to make. I'm excited to see how that goes. That's not something that you see, I think, in as many self-managing organizations. So I'm not sure how that's going to turn out, but it's a really interesting experiment. So I would say like the ready from okay, this probably works, but maybe I need to think about if DAOs are different. And then from the perspective of an actual DAO, I think Index Co-op is doing some interesting things and has faced some interesting challenges too that they've had good responses to. So they're, I think, just good to look at, and you can read their governance forums and things.
Okay. When are we going to be able to tell if the experiment of DAOs has succeeded or failed or needs more time? When is that going to happen?
I think I would point that back to you and say, when will we know in Web3 as an experiment has worked or not? Because I feel like that's the big question.
Fair enough. I feel like for me personally, I would take DAOs and think of them as more successful when I can see a DAO that has very clear connection to the real world. So something like manufacturing a product or something, because information-centric DAOs, they work. They're all virtual, right? I mean, you can figure out and make them work. But once you have to organize labor and factories and trucks and all of that kind of stuff, is that even a possibility to make a DAO? And if so, how will it work? How will it succeed? That's what I'm looking to see.
Yeah, I don't know if DAOs are going to be good for organizations that are not digitally native. Yeah. Like that's the ultimate question, because the other weird thing is that online, like to me, one of the big things is co-ops have done this forever. You know, that definitely works well. But and I think the DAOs could just bring that up to speed. But at that point, it's also like, why does it need to be Web3? The legal paperwork of having several owners of an LLC is a pain in the ass, and maybe that's enough. But I also kind of feel like having the potential for a token that can be bought is a problem, which isn't necessarily a requirement. Like you could just make it so that it's, you know, people can't just get their hands on it. But I don't know, it's going to be interesting. Co-ops though give me hope. Like there are lots of physical co-ops that have worked out well. So that makes me hopeful. Also, my computer is at 3%, so I might need to grab my charger real quick.
No worries. Yeah, the other thing is also, I'm interested to see the autonomous part of DAOs actually working, you know, because right now, I don't see that much in the autonomous, and I'm glad to hear that Snapshot is moving in that direction. But if you were to stick to the spirit of the law here in terms of DAOs, some on day one or day zero or week zero or whatever, some people would codify the rules of the DAO into a smart contract, and you know, that's how it works in perpetuity. I know that's stupid. It would not work. It would break down, but it would be interesting to see if there are models there where the smart contract could also evolve. So there's version 1 of the DAO, like we have seasons, right? So it would be like constitutional amendments at that point, almost.
Yeah. It's interesting because what I've always said is I like to think of the autonomous part as referring to the autonomy of individual contributors as opposed to the DAO itself. Okay. It's interesting because like, if you think, I need a different adjective that's not interesting. So if anybody also has thoughts on that, you let me know, because now I'm like hyper aware of it. But anyway, what's cool is that I think Ethereum you could consider as being a full DAO. Like it is autonomous. It is decentralized. It's kind of an organization. But I think beyond that, we probably have not seen good examples of fully autonomous organizations. And I'm curious to see if we ever will. You've read a lot more sci-fi novels than I have, so you probably have way better predictions on this, because I feel like that gets into like, can't stop computers territory, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting. See, you know, when I have been thinking a lot about DAOs also, and it feels to me that DAOs are really well suited for special purpose projects that span roughly about a year or so. So for example, you know, there's a movie being made, or you decide to, you know, buy that some artwork, or you want to petition to have a bridge made or something. I can see that being really successful over time. But I think there's too many unknowns right now to call, yay, it's going to be a successful model or not. I feel also that this is Gen Zero, right? I feel like it almost takes like a couple of generations for this technology to go through iterations before you arrive at something that really works well. So
Yeah. And I also think one of the things that people are thinking about right now is sub DAOs, which is just these DAOs that emerge within larger DAOs that have their own autonomy. A good example of this is there's a DAO called Pleaser DAO, which is a collector DAO. So they collect all kinds of NFTs and artwork and things. And they had this NFT that they collected, which was the Doge meme, like the original one. I think it went for $4 million or something, and it was all donated to charity, I think. But in any case, they got this NFT and they fractionalized it, which this is like, if I were not in crypto, this would sound crazy. So they fractionalized it, which basically means that they issued tokens that represent fractional ownership of the piece, kind of like issuing, stock for your piece of artwork. And anyone who owned a certain amount can join their community. And so now that community has become its own DAO that puts on events. And I'm sure that there are a lot of other way cooler things that they do that I do not know about, but they're becoming their own DAO. And so that's like a sub DAO of Pleaser DAO. And so I also think, I totally agree, like ephemeral DAOs are something that I think is going to start popping up a lot. Single purpose DAOs are going to start popping up a lot. But I think in a lot of cases, because it's kind of a pain in the ass to have an entire treasury that you raise and then let that go, what we'll probably start to see is large DAOs having a lot of these sub DAOs that pop up. They share resources, all that important stuff. Maybe like the recruiting arm I was talking about before actually is one of the main reasons that you would want to be a sub DAO of a larger DAO instead of doing your own thing and going sort of independent. But so I think we're going to start to see networks of that. And a good example of that is like we have a nation state, and then we have states, and then we have all these things that have emerged within them. So we'll see. I think it's going to be cool to see what ends up being really useful from like a large versus small DAO perspective. And we'll see if they sort of float on their own or start to be really interconnected.
Yeah. In your daily life, in your experience as you're going about through life, have you come across a moment where you feel like, oh man, this should be a DAO and I want to make this into my DAO? Have you thought about anything like that?
I think that media is really cool and underexplored. I'm very interested in some of that just because I think that right now it's like creators have fans and the only way to engage is sort of by like buying stuff. I'm really interested in how can fans become the creator and take like this sort of brand and make it their own, because they're kind of the best people to do that anyways. I think that's really cool. That's like one of the big things that I've been thinking about. I'm also really excited about what Decentology is doing and the fact that it's rooted in all of the open source sort of ethos, but combining that with DAOs and Web3 to me is like the perfect cocktail of like what a DAO can be. So I'm very excited about that too. I think that there are a few cool intersections in terms of like open source.
You run a very successful podcast. Tell us about it. And then I want to ask you if you're going to make that podcast into a DAO.
Yeah, so my podcast explores the human side of Web3, basically having on people who are thinking like very specifically about some of these challenges around like, what does comp look like? How do we manage ourselves? How do we not go crazy being on Twitter all the time and making our like financial worth our identity, because that's also terrible. I've been thinking about experiments that I want to run with the DAO. I don't know if or with the podcast. I don't know if I would make it a DAO itself, but I've been thinking a lot about how I can start to have people who are passionate about having these conversations have a vehicle to do so. But I don't know what that will look like yet. So I have to explore that still.
So, okay, I will look for that because I think it'll be very interesting kind of experiment. So in wrapping up, I wanted to ask you, let's do a little thought experiment here, just brainstorm a little bit. DAO is a ridiculous term. What would we want to replace that with? What would be a better term that is more, people get it, mainstream users would get it, you wouldn't have to explain it, and all of that.
I don't know. People have come up with so many different acronyms. Nick, I feel like you would have an acronym. If anyone I know would have one, it would be you.
I haven't given it as much thought, but it bugs me every time I see the word DAO. I'm like, I need to explain this to people, and so it's not right.
Yeah. So NFT is the same though.
Yeah,
And NFT ended up, well, I guess TBD if it actually is going to get mainstream adoption. I'm not sure that we've actually, like with the internet, was internet a weird term? What were people using before then?
uh, it was actually internets. It was interconnected
Oh.
nets, right? So it got abbreviated kind of to that because TCP/IP was about creating a network of networks to be able to, at the height of the Cold War, withstand a nuclear attack. So that even if one network got taken out, the data could be routed around, and the U.S. would still have supremacy over Russia or whatever that whole thing was during the Cold War. So yeah,
Mhm.
and they imagine it as a family of protocols and not one, so that it would be very modular and you could easily keep growing it. And clearly that has worked because the protocols keep growing, etc. The network model has also worked because things go down, you route around, it works. So I don't know that the terms and things we are making these days are as resilient and or have as much thought put into it, and
Yeah.
because of the times, we are way faster now. Things have to be made and decisions have to be made way faster. But yeah, I'm not sold on the term DAO, and I feel like even with Decentology and another couple of DAOs I'm working with, I just don't want to add the DAO moniker to it. It seems to me like it's going to fade away in a year or so.
Yeah, I think adding the DAO on the DAO name is like more risky because you never know what's going to work and what isn't. You're better off building a brand, and then calling it a DAO on Twitter in the meantime to like signal to people what it is, but slowly fading that into the
Yeah,
background.
yeah. So Chase, it's the top of the hour here. Totally enjoyable conversation. I learned a lot. I hope the people on here also learned a lot. There's a lot more I wanted to talk about, is about how to actually get into a DAO, etc. But that means that you're going to have to come back for another conversation. And I just realized that I could have shipped you some chai and we could have actually had some chai, but I'll make sure I do
Next
that.
time,
Do
next
that
time.
next time.
We will make it happen. I learned a lot. So I'm glad we got to do this, and we will definitely have to have a part 2 and maybe 3 and 4 soon.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks everyone who joined us on this episode of BlockChai and Chill with Chase Chapman. We hope to see you again next week, and signing off then. Bye. Have a wonderful day.
Well, bye.